Hey guys, Naz here. Today we're going to be going over how I made this beetle pattern and as well how to put it together if you just want to use the pattern that I'm providing with this. So this looks like a pretty complicated pattern, but it's not really. It's essentially just a bunch of circles elongated and with bits chopped off them. So if this looks a bit daunting to you, don't worry, we're going to take it one step at a time and hopefully break it down into easy to digest chunks for you to follow along and make this sort of pattern or make this sort of plush. If you're making your own pattern from scratch, the first thing you want to do is you want to find or draw a profile image of the beetle you want to make. I found it a bit hard to find a perfect profile picture of this rhinoceros beetle, so I kind of found a bunch of different pictures and took parts from them and drew what I thought one would look like from the side. Using an image from the side is what we like to start off with when we're drafting our patterns. Now, because this creature is so complicated, there's so many different parts to the beetle, they have very unusual anatomy. What I tried to do is I tried to break it down into different shapes. And I sort of imagined for the body, what would it look like, it sounds a bit morbid, but if you chopped the front half off. And it kind of looks like this long sort of bean shape or oval shape, and you're chopping it off at the front there. So by breaking this pattern down into more simple shapes, it makes it much more easy for us to digest and work out how to sort of pattern it and make a plan of attack. So this shape here really is just a circle that is stretched out, and you can see if we chop off the front, that gives us a pretty close version of what this sort of beetle body area looks like. I'm sorry, I'm not really competent with beetle anatomy. I don't know if it's the carapace or anything like that, so I'm just going to call it the body for now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off first by patterning what that section would look like at the front that has essentially been chopped off our oval pattern. And I'm imagining that it's sort of wider at the base and thinner at the top. So we're kind of going to pattern this onion kind of shape. Now you want to make sure that it's the same height as the height of the body of your sketch. And I'm just going to flip that over to make sure it's nice and symmetrical, and that's going to refine sort of that cross section of the front of the beetle just a little bit more than using a straight circle, though you could do that if you wanted to keep the pattern very simple. I've also marked off where I want it to go roughly in half, so I want to have sort of the beetle's underlayer and then his wings on the top. So I've marked those lines on the sides there of where I sort of want to divide this onion type shape. And I'm just smoothing it out, refining it a little bit so it's not too pointy at the top because it's not a perfect point. You also want to be looking at a bunch of references of the kind of beetle that you're making, and sort of having references open of them from different angles will give you a better idea of sort of what the cross section would look like of your beetle. Now for the other part of this beetle pattern for the body, we're going to be making a sphere, and we're going to be elongating that sphere so it's kind of like a long round oval shape. So I just imported in the pattern that I use for making my spheres, and I just copy and paste this pattern whenever I need to use it rather than drafting it because I know it works. You're welcome to trace this, and you need 4 pieces like this to sew together to make a sphere. So what I've done is I've laid that the direction that I want it to go for the pattern, so horizontal, and I just chopped the top off, so pretty much what we were talking about earlier. I did end up elongating this more for the final pattern. If you go and compare that shape to the quarter sphere that I've included in the final pattern, I did do a test of this and it turned out to be a little too spherical. I wanted it a bit more like an elongated oval shape, but this is exactly the same process for lining up these 2 pattern pieces. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make sure that our circle pieces are going to be long enough at the front where we chopped them off at that sort of blunt edge to sort of go around the circumference of this onion piece, which is going to sit at the front. So I'm just using this sort of long ruler piece as a guide, and I'm going to sort of stretch it around the entire onion, just one half of it, and that's going to give us the entire length of one half of the onion shape. And then we can make sure that when we divide that in half, each of our blunt sort of sphere chopped off front pieces is going to match up with that length. So that this is just ensuring that 2 of those sphere pieces are going to equal 1/2 of the sort of circumference of this onion piece, if that makes sense. And this is very similar to how I pattern a lot of my gussets, just checking out the final sort of perimeter of that distance around the onion shape. So now we have the full length of half of the onion shape. I'm just marking the center of that distance, and then I'm going to use this again, dragging it around the edge of the onion to find the halfway point of the side of the onion. And this ended up working quite perfectly because the halfway point was roughly where the belly intersects with the wing, so about halfway up the onion shape, which is perfect because we do use this to our advantage later on when we go to pattern the wings, and they sat exactly where I wanted them to. So now we're going to bring in that quarter circle that we chopped the top off, and we are going to size it so that the bit that we chopped off is 1/2 of the onion length that we've measured here. So as I mentioned earlier, the chopped off area of that quarter circle needs to equal half of the onion shape, if that makes sense. So 4 of these are going to equal the circumference of the onion shape that is going to sort of cap them off at the front where we've chopped it sort of abruptly on the edge of that circle. And this is pretty much the body patterned. Now we're going to refine it just a little bit to make it more like the shape of our beetle. You can see here that his belly isn't sort of a perfect round shape. It has a little bit of a gauntness to it. It sort of sucks up a little bit. So I'm going to copy our quarter sphere pattern, and the one that we are dragging down from, the one that says top, there's going to be 2 of those, and they're going to stay the same. They're going to be the 2 top pieces of sort of our circle, and this is going to be the 2 bottom pieces of our circle. So I'm just making adjustments to make his belly a little bit more sucked in, a little bit more tucked in, not perfectly spherical. So I'm just thinning it out a little bit there, and this will be, that line there will be where the belly goes, so 2 pieces will join there, and the top of that will line up with the side, and you can see there I'm also marking the side of the 2 top pieces that we're going to use. So your sphere is made up of 4 pieces, 2 of them are going to be that top piece, 2 of them are going to be that belly piece, and they both meet together at those sides and then are sewn around the onion at the front. So that line there is going to match up with that line there is going to match up with that line there, and obviously you're going to flip your other pieces and they're going to line up with the other side of the onion. So I'm just refining it to make the belly a little bit more exaggerated, but you'll see the kind of pattern that we're going to end up with this eventually. As I mentioned earlier, we do elongate these side pieces for the final pattern because they did come out a little too spherical. I needed to lengthen them a little bit beforehand, before the final version, but I tested that for you guys, so it will come out nicely. So now I'm going to cut all of our pieces. So you can see that I've lengthened them a little bit here. This is the second test that I did. And I'm going to do a little bit of decorative stitching on the piece that is marked bottom. So this is our 2 belly pieces. I'm just going to mark a bunch of diagonal lines, and I'm going to be sewing these with a straight stitch onto our pattern piece. And you might notice in the final plush that he has sort of those detailing lines on his belly. This is a very simple way to add sort of curved lines around there. I'm just using a pattern notcher to mark out where all those lines are going to go, and we're going to transfer these lines onto the back of our pattern piece for the 2 belly pieces, and then we're going to sew along them using a straight stitch. You're going to sew with the wrong side up, and we're just going to follow those marker lines that we're putting down with that straight stitch, and that straight stitch will transfer onto the correct side of our pattern. And I'm just making sure that my bobbin thread is the same colour as my top thread in a black when I'm working in this dark grey. So you can see here that I've got all my pattern pieces marked out for the body. So we're going to sew the top of these 2 pieces together. So this is the top piece that makes the back, and then I've drawn all these lines in. You're going to sew them before you sew these 2 pieces together. Once you have, you're going to lay your 2 right sides together, and then you're going to sew the belly together. And then once you've sewn both those lots of 2 together, we're going to meet them up at the sides and sew the sides together on both sides. So you're essentially sewing a circle, just leaving that front section open. So you can see I've done that here. You can see I've done all that detailing on the belly, trying to do my best to make sure that those straight stitches line up for that decorative stitching under the belly. So the top of the onion meets the top of the back, the bottom meets the bottom, and the sides meet the sides. And you're going to put a bunch of pins in that and sew it so you have sort of a nice onion shaped front to the front of that piece. Now I've left a little gap on the top of his back to stuff through, and I've also cut a piece of that onion shape out of some rigid plastic. Now you can use something like the back of a binder, or you can go to the hardware store and get some thin plastic. It's maybe only 1 millimeter thick, but it's rigid enough to stop this stuffing from billowing out that front piece. We want it to stay nice and rigid and flat at the front where that onion piece is. So I'm just feeding it through the back here. Make sure that you leave yourself a big enough gap to feed it through, and pushing it to the front where the onion piece is. And that's what I use for things like my flat pony hooves. It just is going to stop the pattern from billowing out of the front, because we do want it to be like a rigid sort of cut, flat, plain. And I'm going ahead and I'm just going to stuff this beetle like I would anything else. Make sure that it's quite firmly stuffed. If that's what you like, that's what I like to do. And then you can go ahead and close the little section that we've created here to put our stuffing through with a ladder stitch. And here's what our little body piece looks like when it's all done, before it's closed up the top. You can see the sort of decorative stitching is sort of bowed around the bottom of the belly to create sort of a bit of a curved detailing pattern. That's totally optional, you don't have to do that if you don't want to, but I thought it was a fun little thing to add. Now the next thing we're going to pattern is the head and the face, and that is going to be pretty much exactly the same patterning process as we did for the body. We're going to keep it nice and simple. We're going to pretty much just duplicate the pattern that we've already made for the body, and we're going to sort of manipulate that, make it a little bit smaller, alter the shapes just a little bit, but it's essentially the same patterning process for the rest of it here. So we are sort of continuing that theme of taking spheres and sort of spherical shapes and chopping them off at the front or the back. So you can see sort of for his brain cavity or his head here, I'm just taking the onion shape, making it the correct height. I'm making it a little bit less wide because I don't want it quite as wide as the body. And we're going to pretty much repeat the same process, get our sphere shape and adjust it to what I think will make, it's kind of like a half circle, his head shape here. So I've brought in my quarter sphere pattern. I'm going to cut that in half, as I mentioned, or a little bit off half. And we're going to use the larger portion. And we're going to repeat the same process, making sure that that lines up with a quarter of our new onion shape that we've created, making sure to mark everything. A lot of these pattern pieces are very similar to one another, so if you are drafting this pattern from scratch, make sure that you thoroughly label all of them so you don't get too confused. But I'm just going to double check that the chopped off portion of the quarter circle matches up with a quarter of our onion shape for the back of our head. So the flat back of the head cavity is going to line up with the flat front of our body. So I'm marking that piece as the two tops of the head pieces. I'm duplicating that, and I think because I warped our onion shape a little bit, the lower section is going to be a little bit smaller than the upper section. So I'm just patterning a separate quarter sphere to match the bottom of the onion for this particular piece. So that matches nicely. You can see it's a little bit thinner than the top piece that we've done there. Now for his face, we're going to copy this pattern that we've just made for the head. So I'm patterning the face separately to the head. And you can see that this sort of face section here, if you discount the horn, it's kind of like half a sphere that's been flattened as well down the bottom. So I'm going to replicate this in our pattern, just by modifying that sphere shape. So we have the top of the face, so 2 pieces that will make the top of the face and 2 pieces that will make the bottom of the face. And I'm leaving the onion shape the same, and I'm just going to make sure that the bottom of that bottom piece, so the piece that's labelled bottom face, we're going to chop off the bottom of that and just make it a little bit more flat rather than curved out. And this is going to sort of match that flat bottom of the beetle's face that you can see in our little sketch there. And there's really not too much that you need to change apart from that. I think I go ahead with this patterning and just flatten sort of where his nose would go a little bit more, but leaving the crest of his head a bit curved. But you can see just by editing sphere shapes, you can create so many different sort of organic, semicircular kind of shapes just by using portions of spheres and editing them a little bit. I think it's quite a useful skill to have. So that's pretty much our face patterned and our head patterned. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew them and stuff them in exactly the same method that we used for the body. So you're going to sew the 2 top sphere quarters at the top, the 2 bottom sphere quarters at the bottom, then match them up at the sides, sew the 2 sides, and then sew the onion shape to them at the front. Insert your little hard plastic piece in your onion shape against the inner onion shape and add your stuffing. And that's pretty much going to be exactly what you need for the head and the face. So you can see here that I've finished sewing both the head and the face separate sections. I'm just adding the hard plastic and I'll stuff them in a second, and then we are going to pin them onto the front of our body piece that we patterned earlier and stuffed. So you're going to pin the head section, the flat section of the head section, to the flat front of the body, and you're going to pin the flat back of the face to the rounded front of the head section. And you can just tweak that to be sitting exactly where you want. I sort of tried to place the head roughly in the middle of the body, and then the face sat a little bit lower on the head, if that makes sense. And then you would put all these pieces together using a ladder stitch. So a lot of hand sewing to put this beetle together, but that's what you get when you ask for a really complicated pattern that has heaps of legs and heaps of different body parts. So enjoy all that hand stitching. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to pattern the wings, and we're going to pattern the armour for his head, as well as his armour that sort of sits on top of his head that goes up into his nose. So one thing that I found out, to my surprise and sort of delight, is that you can reuse half of these patterns to create sort of caps that sit on the top of him. So here we're going to be patterning his head cap that includes this little sprout like horn on the top of his head. So what we're doing is we're taking the top piece of our previous head pattern and we're going to convert this into a head cap. And really what we're doing is we're just sewing the head like we did previously, modifying it a tiny bit but not actually stuffing it, and using that as kind of a skin that sits over the top of that previous head shape that we made. So you can see that I've labelled them here, and the one that's going to sit on the top, I'm just adding this sort of sprout shape to the top of it, starting and ending where the pattern starts and ends at the top. And that's going to sew together and create that little horn shape. And then we're essentially going to sew the sphere like we would have otherwise, and that's going to create like an empty sphere skin, and we're going to lay that over the top of our headpiece that we patterned and stuffed previously, and that's going to look like a sort of raised armour piece that sits on top of that head there. Now we're going to repeat the same process for patterning the horn, or sort of the face cap that includes the horn. So we're repeating the same process as before, getting the top of the head shape, and we're going to turn that into the face cap, so that's the underneath piece, and for the piece that's going to sit on the top, we're going to draw that horn in. Now, because the horn has a lot of detail at the top, I'm going to be patterning just the base of it, and then we're going to pattern the horn portion separately so that we can draw it from the front. I noticed in a lot of my reference images, it's kind of like a branching tree shape when viewed from the front. So I'm just making sure that the base of the horn is the same width as that sort of base little piece that we've marked at the bottom there on top of our cap. And we're going to draw our details of the horn as if it was viewed from the front on top of this long sort of trunk stem piece. I'll just adjust that to make sure that it's nice and flat. I did edit this pattern a few times. I worked on the actual shape of sort of the decorative top of the horn a couple of times. I ended up just sketching on top of a reference that I found that had a horn shape that I liked, making sure that it was nice and horizontal and that the base of it matched up with the base of the sort of top trunk of the horn there. This ended up being too small. When I tested it out and sewed it out, I'd liked it to sort of have a very large sort of set of prongs at the end of the horn, so I did end up editing this for the final pattern that I provide with you guys. So I'm just cleaning this horn piece up here. I'm adding some registration marks so that when we sew our two horn pieces together, it's going to be a little bit easier to line them up because they are so long. When you're making your horn shape, if you are making something like a rhinoceros beetle here, you want to exaggerate the shapes in sort of the prongs of the horn so that they do show up when you eventually sew and stuff them in Minky, because if they're too subtle, you won't really see them. So here are all our pieces that we're going to use for the cap for the head and the cap for the body. I think I've actually lost the footage of when I patterned the wings, but it's exactly the same process. You're really just making the entire beetle body again, but not stuffing it and not including the onion shape at the front, so sewing it together where you would have left it open to sew against the onion shape at the front, and you'll see what that looks like when we sew that together. So we've sewn our two bottom pieces and our two top pieces together. We're going to sew this all around the edge, so totally sewing at the front, all around the back. You can see I've left a little section to open it and close it from the underside, and this is essentially what it's going to do. It's going to sit on top of our body pattern as like a flat piece, but is going to raise up and look sort of like wings. So I've sewn that, chopped all my seams. I'm going to turn it inside out, and then I'm going to match it up with sort of the center top of the beetle's back, and I'm going to pin it so it matches where his belly starts around the side there. I've really just used exactly the same pattern as we did for the beetle. You can just duplicate the top section, the sort of top quarter that we patterned, and do that 4 times. I would, if I made this pattern again, perhaps make it a little bit wider, because I really had to stretch this pattern to go all the way down to his sides because it isn't stuffed. I had to really pull on the Minky to get it to line up. But I think if you made it a little bit bigger, the wings would sit, they wouldn't need to be as stretched, so they would sit more up or more outwards. They would be a little bit more 3D. So that's just something to consider if you want really sort of skin tight wings pressed against his body, matching up with the sides there, or do you want them to sit a little bit broader, so make that pattern a little bit larger if that's what you'd like to do. After you've got this all pinned in place, you can again use a ladder stitch to fix it onto the beetle's body. I don't think you would need to ladder stitch all the way around, just in some key areas to make sure that the wings sit flat against the body. I'm just doing some tacking stitches to make sure that they sit where you want them to. So here are all the pieces that we're going to need for our caps and the horn. So you can sew the top section of the sprout horn together, the bottom piece together, sew all around the horn, sew the top to the top, the bottom to the bottom, etc. And then we'll go ahead and sew around the sides to make them all sort of cohesive pieces. So you can see that I've done 2 of the top pieces together and 2 of the bottom pieces together, as you would when sewing the rest of this pattern. And I'm just going to meet the sides up on both of those and sew all the way around, making sure to leave a little gap to turn it inside out. And you want the exact same process with your face piece. You can see that I haven't attached the horn yet, and the reason for this is we're going to be turning it 90 degrees. So instead of having it go sort of horizontal, matching up with the face viewed from the side, the horn is going to twist 90 degrees. We're going to sew it onto sort of that horn base, and it's going to then sort of sit rising up from the face rather than running along the face. So our prongs are going to be horizontal when viewed from the front. And I just used a bit of hand stitching using a back stitch to sew that little horn in place because it is very fiddly to attach. It's sort of sewing one tube onto another tube. You can see here that I've done what we did with the wings earlier for the cap for the head, and you can see how it's made this little 3D shape for his little sort of sprout horn that he has on the top of his main sort of large headpiece. I've also added a little bit of stuffing in the base of it just so that it keeps its shape. You don't need to add a whole lot, but you can stuff that horn to make sure that it's nice and rigid and it's not going to become too floppy. And just repeating the same process as before, pinning it in place, doing some ladder stitching, and we're going to repeat the same process with the horn that's going to go on the face. And you can choose which sort of direction this goes. I actually ended up putting it on backwards. I liked the shape that it made a little bit better. So I'm just slipping that underneath the cap that we've made for the head and pinning that to our face. You can also add a little bit of thin wire into the horn because it is so long if you want it to stay curved up nicely. Because I'm not finishing this plush, I didn't add any wire into that horn, but that is an option if you wanted to. Something as long as that is probably going to need wire to stay in a nice pretty shape long term. If you want this guy to be a bit more floppy and cuddly, it doesn't really matter too much, but you don't want his horn to get really floppy. But you can see it's sitting nicely here. I've got everything pinned in place, and you would just go ahead and you would do your ladder stitch to tack down all the pieces that need tacking down. Now we get to the really painful part of this pattern, which is sewing all the different parts of the legs. You can definitely simplify this if you don't want to go to so much effort. I broke each leg into 3 separate pieces, so you can see that I've sort of marked them here. I traced over the legs of some beetles that I found. I liked sort of the arrangement of their leg spikes, but these beetles seem to have a lot of variation in the spikes of their legs. So you can see I've broken it into 3 different sections, and I'm scaling it to match what I think will be the correct scale for this beetle here, just matching it up to my sketch. Now I will say that I did resize these a couple of times, made them larger just to make them easier to sew, but this is very fiddly sewing to do. You're doing all sort of these long tube shapes with these little spikes on them, leaving the bottom, or for the top piece you're leaving the bottom open, for the middle piece you're leaving the top and bottom of it open, and for the bottom foot piece you're leaving the top of it open to add stuffing and to feed it along the wire that we're going to be using. So I'm just going ahead and I'm drawing over this sketch that I did, trying to make it relatively symmetrical for this top piece here, and I'm just trying to line that up with, I've just brought this little straight line into Photoshop to give me a guide of trying to make these pieces relatively vertical. Now obviously the centerpiece is not symmetrical, it has these spikes at one side, but I'm just trying to make it relatively vertical for the purposes of printing out our pattern, drawing out those spikes, trying to not make the spikes too thin, otherwise they'll be impossible to turn inside out. And then I made the little feet symmetrical on this guy as well. So you have piece 1, piece 2, piece 3, and you can scale them appropriately. I would suggest printing them out at the scale that I have in the pattern and testing sewing a couple of them and seeing if it's too small for you to turn inside out, because it is quite tricky. So it was a lot of fiddling for me to turn them inside out. So if you find that too difficult, make them a little bit larger and try again. Otherwise you're just going to be swearing your head off and getting very frustrated, as they're pretty difficult to turn inside out. Now instead of sewing, so what do we need? Each leg has 3 sections and we have 6 legs. So we have 18 different leg pieces that we need to sew. So instead of driving myself crazy and manually sewing every single one of them on my sewing machine, I programmed that into an embroidery file, and I'm just using a straight stitch, sandwiching 2 pieces of minky right sides together in my hoop, and I'm stitching out all those leg pieces using my embroidery machine. So even if you have quite a small hoop, this is going to save you a whole lot of time, because it's just sewing so many of those little pieces. I apologise if you don't have an embroidery machine and have to manually sew all those leg pieces, but as I mentioned earlier, you can definitely simplify them. You could even just use a long tube and just have sort of the little finger claws that he has at the end, and that would still look really good. So it just depends on how much work you want to put in to making those little segmented legs, because it is a lot of work to finish this guy up. He's not a simple plush to put together just for the amount of pieces that go into him. So I'm just speeding this way up here. I ended up fitting just all the pieces I needed into my hoop. So I'm going over with this stitching and stitching everything twice to make sure that it's stitched nice and strong with a straight stitch, and leaving little sections in the pattern that I've designed for them to be turned inside out. So you don't want to sew all the way around, you want to leave a little gap for you to turn them inside out. Now I did have to redo this twice because I made them too small, as I mentioned earlier. So this is the first time that I stitched them out. They were way too small, pretty much impossible for me to turn inside out, so I ended up making them larger and redoing this until they were a scale that I could comfortably turn inside out. But even then, comfortably is kind of a loose term, because these are really fiddly pieces to turn inside out. If you want more information on how to sew things in the hoop, I do have a tutorial. I think it's called How to Sew Wings in the Hoop, but it essentially goes over the process of digitizing a file and how to lay out everything so that you can sew your fabric in the hoop and have the machine do the sewing for you, rather than you manually doing all 18 of these little leg pieces if your beetle has that many legs and that many sections in its legs. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add some wire to sort of his little prong feet, so that you can pose them, make them a bit more clawy. I'm just leaving this as raw wire for the example of showing you here. I personally wouldn't leave it raw if I was finishing this plush or giving it to anyone. I would go ahead and finish this wire. I do have a wiring tutorial that goes over how I like to finish the wire to make it safe for handling, if you want to go back and watch that tutorial for this, for using wire in this beetle. But for this purpose I'm just showing you where I would put the wire. So I'm sort of just making a bunch of little U shapes for the end of his feet here, roughly, measuring the distance of each of his toes or each of his claws and doubling that. I'm feeding it down through the tube and then pushing it to the tips of his sort of little fingers at the end there. And then you can use something like a pair of pliers to bend them in the shape that you want. So I made them spread out a little bit and claw a little bit, and I think that just made them look a little bit more accurate to the shape that I was trying to capture. Again, this is really fiddly, so if you find it too difficult, blow up the pattern, make it larger, and that will make things much easier for you to make with these fiddly little leg sections. So go ahead and repeat this 6 times, and then I'll see you back here when we're going to wire the rest of the legs. So I have all of the leg pieces set out in order of, the top piece is the top, the middle is at the middle, and the bottom is at the bottom. We've wired the toes, and now we're going to measure out the wire that is going to go through one side of his body to the other. And then we're going to feed, kind of like kebabs, feed the leg pieces up through this wire, and then stitch them all together by hand. This is a whole lot of work, but you guys asked for a beetle pattern. There was a lot of frustration involved in turning all those tiny little leg pieces out. It took a lot longer than I anticipated, but really, to find out the length of the wire, you're going to measure your leg pieces sort of as a whole. You're going to measure the span of the belly, where you're going to be piecing through one side to the other, and then that's going to be the length of the wire that you need to cut. Here I'm just using a thin gauge fencing wire because it doesn't need to be too strong. It just needs to be able to hold those legs together. You can use something a little bit stronger if you want the beetle to really be able to stand up and hold his big heavy body, but I sort of just have them splaying out. So you can see here I'm just doing the math of each piece that I'm going to need for the wire. I'm going to cut that out, and so you're sort of going to kebab your legs at one side, then feed the other length through, then kebab them at the other side and sew them all together. So you can see here that I've added all the legs through the wire, and I've bent the wire to be the shape that I want it to be, so you can have sort of some zigzags going on in your legs. Just look at some references. I've just added little dabs of hot glue to hold them together for the purposes of this video, but you will want to lattice stitch around every single one of those intersections on those legs, which is going to be a lot of work. So I hope you guys really like beetles. But this is essentially what he looks like finished. Now we're just going to make him a little set of eyes, a little bonus. I wanted to make him some sort of really kawaii, cute, glossy eyes, not embroidered, so they were a bit 3D. So I've gone ahead and I've got some 2-part epoxy, and I've got these little teddy bear noses that I got from the craft store. I couldn't find big round eyes, so I just grabbed these. We're going to be stealing the backs of them. And all we've done is I've mixed up some 2-part epoxy, and that's just like a clay that you mix 2 parts and then it dries hard. I've sort of moulded that into 2 circle shapes, and I've pressed that into those teddy bear noses. So we're going to pretty much steal the backing fixings of them so that you can press these into the head and then close it up with the little backings that would be used for the teddy bear noses. I painted them as well with just a couple of dots of white and sealed them with some glossy sealant. And there you have some very quick kawaii beetle eyes for your finished beetle. And that's just a really quick and dirty method of making some sort of clay type glossy eyes. The only thing that I forgot to film me patterning is the little feelers sort of at the front of his face, but I've included that in the pattern. They're really just 2 long bendy shapes like bananas with the ends chopped off that I sewed together and stuffed and pinned to his face. So really simple. Just go ahead and use the pattern provided. If I was to sew them again, I'd probably make them a little bit smaller. I think they're a little bit cartoony large on the front of his face there, but he looks pretty cute to me. Now I obviously haven't done any of the hand sewing required on this beetle because this still took me a couple of days to put together without all the hand sewing, and I'm not going to be finishing this guy up, but I just wanted to show you guys what he looked like finished. Now I realise that this is a bit of a complicated pattern, not in the construction but just with how many pieces that go into it, so feel free to simplify it if you'd like. I'm really happy with how many people sort of signed up to get this pattern. I hope that it's not too complicated for some of you that may be on sort of the beginner side. But if you are and you're struggling to put this pattern together, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'll do my best to try and help you put it together if you don't have much sewing experience. But if you have any questions, as usual, send me a message on Patreon or social media and I'll do my best to get back to you. But really thank you guys for the support that you've been giving me with making these animal patterns. It's been really amazing for me to see some growth in my Patreon after so long. It's sort of been in the deficit for a long time, so to see some growth and some support. You guys really seem to like these cute animal patterns, and I really like the challenge of making them sort of as cute as possible, as quickly as possible. So yeah, thanks again. I hope to be making a lot more cute animals for you guys in the future, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.